So if you based it on sheer numbers alone, this has got to be my best week ever in terms of finishing books. Here they all are. However, if we talk about actual number of pages read, I'm pretty sure it's probably fairly typical for me. So let's go ahead and discuss, because that pile definitely looks way more impressive than it actually is. But I'm still pretty happy with how my reading week went. So first of all, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or should I say the mammoth in the room? Either way, let's talk about The Mysteries of Paris. I did it, guys. I finished this book. It may have taken what felt like all of my life, or at least a good chunk of the year, but in reality, I've actually only been reading this book from April. And since April, I have read a chapter a day most days, not even every day. And the chapters are short. They're like 10 to 10 pages on average. And this has gone really well. I read this entire book with Stormy at Storm Reads, so I'm sure she has a lot to say about it as well. You can go check out her channel for that. And do we feel accomplished? Yes. Was it worth it? Well, that's a whole different question. Let me tell you what this book is about now that I've read the entire 1,300 and 63 pages. This book, The Mysteries of Paris, is basically the OG story about crime and life of the poor in urban cities, specifically in this case in Paris. This is the book that inspired the writing of Les Mis. It inspired Count of Monte Cristo. In fact, apparently Dumas had ideas for the story to go in a completely different direction in some aspects and was told by his editor, no, make it more like The Mysteries of Paris. So does that mean you should read The Mysteries of Paris? Well, let me tell you my thoughts on it. This was an okay read. It definitely had some highs and some lows, and I'm going to share both with you. I will say that I did care about the characters in this book. There is some good characterization. At first, it feels very cheesy. In some ways, I would almost say the writing in this is too simple because there is like a fight scene at the beginning that definitely feels like the original Batman, where I was just waiting for sound effects to start being written out, like kapow, blam, and like a little bubble. So there were aspects where the writing did fail you and kind of got cheesy, but you did still get into the characters. You spend a long time with the characters and you get to know them pretty well. And the characterization is maybe not the best I've ever read, but it is good, and it's good enough that you do come to care about what's going to happen to your main protagonist in here, and you want to know how things are going to work out. The good people in here are really good. The bad people are pretty horrible. But there's also some great characters who are, struggling between good and evil, and you're not sure where they're going to fall. So I would say that the characterization was a high. The other high was probably the storyline that you start out with. You start out with a handful of characters in the city. The number of characters goes up what feels like at some point is going to be exponentially, but you do start getting reoccurring characters eventually. But I will say in the first few chapters, you're definitely going to want to write down people's names and how they're related, because the characters are going to come fast and hard. The storyline that follows Songbird, that follows Rudolph, that follows some of the original, I'd say like 5 or 6 characters you meet, is really compelling. A lot happens in this book, just like you have in Les Mis and in the Count of Monte Cristo, if you've read those, where you are sort of on this adventure and there's kidnapping and there's threats and there's fights and this and that, and the quality of them does improve as the book goes on, and it's very exciting. The reason I say more the storyline is because that's the storyline of the book. Is that the plot of the whole book? You could argue maybe yes, but kind of like War and Peace, if you've read that, where you have like the story and then you have sort of almost an essay going on in the background as well. This book kind of does that in its structure. So I don't want to say necessarily that I enjoyed the whole plotting of the book, because I feel like with plot, it's hard to break that apart from the structure. And I was not a fan of how this book was structured. You start getting, after a few chapters, the author, Eugene, his narrative voice comes into this more and more strongly, but his narrative voice starts to get away from the narration of the story and starts to get more into his own political ideas and thoughts. And there's times where I just felt like he was on a soapbox preaching at me from his book, right smack in the middle of a dramatic scene. And I was like, I feel like what you're saying is important, and I do want to care about it. Not in the middle of the height of the drama, though. And because this book was serialized, there is definitely a conversation that was happening between him and his audience at the time. This appeared in, I think, daily subscriptions and the newspaper it was appearing in. So you would get one chapter each day, which worked out for how we were reading it. But there were definitely days where the chapter that you got wasn't a chapter that had to do with the storyline, but was just sort of like an editorial response on his part to whatever other people had been commenting on about the story at the time. So they're responses that I almost wish had been put in an appendix so that you could go and see them when you felt like it was appropriate. But in the middle of the book, it was just super disruptive. So that's my second high. That bled into a low. Anyway, let me talk to you about the lows in this book, because clearly there were a lot. So I think I've actually pretty much mentioned them all. The language of the book is overly simplistic at times to the point where it seems cheesy or corny, or there's just moments that just aren't well written and it's kind of ruining what you want to have happen. The structure of the book going back and forth in some ways between these like more and more disruptive essays was frustrating at points because I felt like they were just not well timed in terms of the storyline. And then the plotting of the book, I wasn't always a huge fan of. There were moments in the book that I felt like I was really looking forward to in terms of things happening in the characters' lives, that by the time you got to them, he would just tell you about it. He wouldn't show it to you. You wouldn't see, the amazing scene that you were, spending hundreds of pages waiting to get to. You'd just be like, oh, and then that happened. And you're like, that's it? Like, I don't get to see this? You're just going to tell me it happened? Well, of course it happened. You led up to it happening. At the end of the day, I ended up giving this book one of my very uncomfortable 4s. And I'm pretty sure that's what it says on Storygraph, is that it's a 4. It was a good book. It could have just been so much better if those things had have been fixed. If I was doing half stars again, this would probably be a 3.5 star. I feel like it's better than okay, but it's not as good as good, if that makes sense. So it's got to be somewhere in between. But I just had such high hopes. Honestly, this is a book that, kind of like Les Mis, I really wish was abridged. And that somebody would come out with an abridged edition to this, or that somebody would come out with an edition where they put in the appendix all of those interruptions to the story. The story in this itself is really good. The preaching by Eugene Sue is important, but is super disruptive to the storyline. So who would I recommend this book to? I would recommend this book to anyone who's really interested in learning about what it was like in the early 1800s in Paris, because you're going to hear a lot about that and a lot of Eugene Sue's opinions on that. So you really have to kind of be invested in that information, almost more than the story itself. I think this book would also appeal to people who are fans of War and Peace, but specifically the parts of War and Peace that made Tolstoy call it not a novel, in terms of he planned War and Peace and he knew that there was going to be this story, but that the story is really just showing you an example of what he's talking about in the more essay parts of the book. Tolstoy did a better job at that because I actually really love War and Peace, but that's not the part of it that I love. I actually love the story that's in War and Peace, and I think Tolstoy's writing is good enough that the more essay-feeling parts really hold together well. I will not say the same is true of this, but I think if you like that essay part of War and Peace a lot, maybe even more than the story, you will probably like this book for the same reason. At the end of the day, though, I have to say, if you are just looking for a good long read for entertainment purposes, or you like to read books for the well-structured story, I would say The Count of Monte Cristo is probably a better bet. If you don't mind tangents to your storyline, I would then go with War and Peace or Les Mis. Both of those are still going to be better books than this one. So is this book worth reading? Yeah, but it really depends on your preference. I don't regret reading this, however. I did find the story interesting because I've read both The Count of Monte Cristo and Les Mis. It was fun to kind of see wow, yeah, this really does feel like that. Ooh, this is really similar. There is also another gigantic book similar to this called The Mysteries of London, which was actually written by a different author. And I am curious and interested in reading about that because I did like the story of this. So I will probably do some more legwork to make sure that that book doesn't include quite as much soapbox action. But that said, this was a fun read. I'm not sure that I would ever reread it, but I'm holding on to this copy just to hold open doors. Okay, so that brings me to the next handful of books that I read, which were all part of my Bring Your Own Christmas Story read-along, where I spent the entire day on a Saturday with some viewers just hanging out and reading a whole bunch of Christmas stories. Thank you to everybody who joined me. I hope you all had a good time. I know I had a blast. So let me talk about the variety of books that I read on that day. So the first book that I read was out of this collection of Charles Dickens Christmas books, and I read the classic A Christmas Carol. And this is the OG Christmas classic, I feel like, about Ebenezer Scrooge, miser, grouch, and the originator of Bah Humbug. And it tells the story of what happens to him one Christmas Eve when he is visited by three strangers in a life-changing encounter. Surprisingly, I don't think I've ever actually read A Christmas Carol before, despite the fact that it is one of my favorite Christmas movies, and every version of it, though my favorite is The Muppets Christmas Carol for sure. That said, I was really surprised by this book. Was I surprised by this book? I don't know. I loved the book. I can say that. It was a short read, but it was so beautiful. It's everything that I love about Charles Dickens in terms of his writing. There's some funny moments in it. There's some beautiful writing in it, moving scenes, and yeah, you just feel all of it. The warmth, the depth of the characters, the pacing of it is excellent. It moves along so well throughout the entire story, and it really is a fast read. You may know the story of A Christmas Carol, but if you haven't read it, pick up a copy and read it today. Find it online for free. Do what you gotta do. It's definitely worth giving a read. It's heartwarming and just has some great life lessons in it as well, but you don't feel hit over the head by them. It just makes you feel warm inside. Are there any lows to this book? No, I don't think so. I tend to have a hard time judging Charles Dickens' writing. I can judge him, but his writing is a whole nother matter. So I gave this book 5 stars. I would recommend it to anybody who is just looking for a heartwarming, interesting story set at Christmas time. Another fun Christmas classic that I read was The Tale of the Nutcracker by Alexandre Dumas. This is a bind-up with E.T.A. Hoffmann's Nutcracker and the Mouse King, and the reason that these two are bound up together is because The Tale of the Nutcracker is actually a retelling of Hoffmann's work. And it's interesting because The Tale of the Nutcracker starts with the author talking about how and why he originally wrote this story, and he mentions in it that he's retelling this other story. It's a very cute setup to the book. It has one of my favorite sort of narrative devices, which is embedded narratives, where you have a story within a story within a story. And in that sense, it reminded me of the Arabian Nights, where I was like, where is this going to end? How deep are we going down this rabbit hole? But there were just so many things to love about this. This story, The Tale of the Nutcracker, I felt like was your classic Christmas time setting, but with a wonderful fairy tale twist. So if you like classic fairy tales and you have not read The Tale of the Nutcracker, I highly recommend this to you. It was another 5-star read for me, which I very much expected. I love Alexandre Dumas' writing. I feel like it's very just smooth and straightforward in the way it tends to be translated. And his stories are so well paced and thought out. And I feel like all the little ends always get tied up really nicely, but not in a predictable fashion. And so I definitely appreciate that. There's always, really good themes in here as well to get you thinking. And this is definitely a story that you could read to children, but I feel like people of every age would appreciate it as well. Next, I had an unexpected Christmas read, and that was The Night Before Christmas by Nikolai Gogol. And I'm going to say right off the bat, if you are thinking that this is a story that is similar to The Christmas Rhyme, it is not. It's a very different story. I do not believe there are any connections between the two. So this is a classic story set in a small Ukrainian village. This story tells you about Beefcake Volkula, the local blacksmith, and the luscious Oksana, as Volkula fights against the devil and who knows what else to try and win the heart of his beloved Oksana, while she flounces around in her pretty dresses. It is a classic Ukrainian tale, like I mentioned, and It's really quirky. It's different. It wasn't what I was expecting, but somehow it was also kind of fun and unique. So if you're looking for a different Christmas story that has witches, devils, and a few other surprises in it, I would definitely check this out. It's a very short, fast read and just something to keep you in the winter spirit, no matter what time of the year it is, really. But it's definitely a winter and Christmas fairy tale. Though I would say it leans more on the side of winter. Christmas comes up here and there, but I think it's probably also just a fun wintertime tale. And the last book that I read this week and finished is A Christmas Story. And yes, this is the movie with Ralphie as a book. And in fact, the book came first. This book is made up of 4 autobiographical accounts written by Gene Shepherd, who is actually the author of the screenplay for A Christmas Story, the movie. So the movie is actually based off of his screenplay, but his screenplay is based off of an autobiographical book that he wrote. And to create this book, they basically took 4 of the stories out of the autobiographical book, and if I can find a picture of it, I'll put it on the screen. And all 4 of those stories are basically also scenes in the movie, and they bound them up separately into this book, A Christmas Story. So these are autobiographical accounts as told by Gene Shepherd, but the writing style will feel very, very familiar if you have watched the movie 9 million times like I have. The writing style was actually something that I loved and hated all at the same time. It's a very different, unique writing style, very sort of maximalist and feel kind of rambly and wandery and all over the place. If you have seen the movie a lot, there is a narrator narrating the whole story, and it's basically supposed to be Ralphie as an older man narrating the story of his life. That narration voice is the voice of Gene Shepherd. The way that that narrator speaks is exactly what you're going to hear in all of these accounts throughout. So if you have that in the back of your mind, this book is going to feel very familiar. There are some slight changes in the story that were made in the movie, and so it was interesting to see how they were similar and how they were different. The parts of this book that I feel like were high were the fact that I felt like I got even deeper into some of the stories, that I got like a little bit of extra information. And I feel like it's really going to kind of change the way that I see some of the scenes in the movie, because now I have more background information about what was going on. Because there are definitely things that you get in the book that you can tell why weren't included in the movie. Like, it just would have been hard to portray on film in a way that would have been interesting. But in the book, it's very fascinating. I think the biggest low of this book is just that there were definitely moments that didn't age quite as well, where you either felt like there was some mean-spiritedness going on, or just the portrayal, particularly in story number 4 in here, the portrayal of people, you feel like you're like, okay. So I would say that of the 4 stories in here, I liked the first 3. I really wish they had left the 4th one out. I just didn't need that. So that's what you get with an older story, I guess. This book has been in print for quite a while, and I'm glad I picked it up and read it because I do really enjoy this movie. I gave this book 4 stars, and I would recommend it to anyone who loves the movie A Christmas Story. I think there's a lot to love in this book, so long as you don't get tripped up by some of the parts that are a bit more dated. So that concludes all the books that I have finished this week. It was quite a stack and quite a lot of work, but it was a ton of fun. So I showed you at the beginning all the books that I finished. So I guess at the end, I'll show you all the books that I'm still currently reading and working on. So that's it for me this week. Let me know how your week of reading went, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.